He was incarcerated at 24 years old after gunning down 13 people in New York City. He was a serial killer at loose. He had lit 1,400 fires in addition to the 13 random shootings. And then in 1977, he's arrested. He's put behind bars. And it's amazing because in 1988, the son of Sam, that was his name as a serial killer, becomes a son of God. So
Hey, y'all. Welcome back to the Sparkfaith podcast. I am Dr. Chris Sargent, and yes, I am feeling a little rough today, but I had to bring this most fascinating guest today. Dr. Michael Caparrelli reached out to me, and his story is fascinating. He just wrote this book called Monster Mirrored. Dr. Caparrelli has a PhD in advanced studies in human behavior. And y'all, he spent 100 hours with David Berkowitz. And if you may be like, who is that? And why don't I know who that is? It's because you're young. And you were probably born in the 80s or the 70s because David Berkowitz was son of Sam, and he basically held New York City hostage for a very, very long time. And it was a very scary time. And so Dr. Caparrelli has written a fascinating book about the fact that there are about 9 different themes in the background of all of us. And it's our choices and the way that we approach our lives that determine whether we end up like David Berkowitz, being diagnosed as a psychopath and having demonic possession or being possessed by demons or the Satan, versus having kind of the normal life, if any of us are even normal, right, Michael? So welcome to the show, Doc. I really appreciate you reaching out. This is going to be a fun and interesting conversation.
thank you for having me. Excited to be with you. I'm blessed by your ministry and what you're doing in the mental health field.
Thank you. Well, the mental health piece for me is part of the whole, right? As a whole person, eat, drink, move, sleep, think, feel, faith. And so all of those pieces really work together. And you have the whole think, feel, faith piece sort of all wrapped up in what you do. And then I'm going to come alongside and we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition today, y'all, about is there an interplay here? Because I strongly believe that there is. And then how we're all like little psychopaths just waiting to happen. I hate to even say it that way because it sounds a little bit trite, but I think the way that your book lays it out is that we all have some of these tendencies, right? So let's jump right in. I wanted to just pop through the 9 themes of your book, and then we'll pop into whatever feels comfortable for you. But the first thing is isolation, and how our own sense of isolation in this world can be amped up or not. And that's the same with all of these themes. Anger, shame. We certainly talk a lot about shame on my podcast and around body image, and David Berkowitz definitely had that, but he also had deeper shame around his mom, his birth mom. Abandonment trauma. We all have abandonment issues. De-individuation, which is kind of the big word for peer pressure and maybe mob mentality, kind of, if I'm reading it right, you can correct me. And then there's head trauma and prenatal programming. And we know much more about prenatal programming now than we ever did. And it's still in its infancy. The feeling of emptiness, cognitive distortions, how the stories we tell ourselves may be true, maybe not be true, and are certainly influenced by the people around us and our environment. Our own defense mechanisms, how we manage all of those things. And then like just being a baby to all of this. So jump in. Where do you want to start?
Well, let me begin by saying I sat with David Berkowitz for 100 hours, 34 sessions. He is incarcerated at Shorgunk Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York. He has been in prison for 46 years. In 1977, he was incarcerated at 24 years old after gunning down 13 people in New York City. He was a serial killer at loose. He had lit 1,400 fires in addition to the 13 random shootings. I mean, he would approach a car parked in New York City, usually a couple making out in what was known as a lover's lane. And he would emerge out of the shadows and unload his 44 caliber bulldog revolver into the bodies of these young 20, 21-year-old couples. And then in 1977, he's arrested. He's put behind bars. And it's amazing because in 1988, the son of Sam, that was his name as a serial killer, becomes a son of God. So I had an opportunity to sit with a man who's been walking with Christ for 35 years, and the 100 hours of data collection, sitting with him, one interview after another, usually 3 to 4 hour interviews. These 9 themes surface. And the first you mentioned was isolation. David is not your stereotypical loner. I mean, he grew up in New York City. This is the busiest, most populated city in the country. He's part of baseball teams growing up in the Bronx. He's part of the Appalachian Mountain Club, which was a group of kids from the city that bussed to the upstate part of New York and climbed the mountains, joined the military for 3 years. So we think loner, we think isolated. Typically, we think like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, a hermit in a cabin with a long, shaggy beard away from people. That's not the kind of isolation that David's story speaks about. I think it's the isolation that most people listening right now or watching can relate to. You're part of the group, but you always feel on the fringes. You're with the people that you're with, but you're not really of them. Or to use your phrase, Doc, present, but not presence. You're being with people, but you're not bonding with people. That was David's story. He always felt disconnected. In fact, if you look at a lot of these school shooters, there are about 13 mass shootings a week in the United States of America. 13 a week, by the way.
So can we just stop for half a second right there, because I think
Yeah.
people need to hear that. And I think that y'all listen, 13 a week. That means our local media is not telling us everything that goes on, right? We hear about, like, I mean, we're here in Nashville. There was a horrible shooting here in Nashville about a year ago, at a Christian school, and it was, I don't know how widely televised it was, right? We don't know what happens in these other states always.
You know, you don't see these types of shootings within your collectivist nations. What I mean by collectivist is nations that emphasize community, where the we is more important than the me. You don't see that kind of phenomenon happening in Asian countries, African villages. It just doesn't happen. Yet in your more individualistic cultures, in America may be very extrovert on one hand, very outgoing. We're very loud and boisterous on social media with our selfies. But on the other hand, there's a disconnect between people, that we're very individualistic. The me is far more significant than the we. And it's within those kinds of nations that we see these mass shootings. Now, University of Japan did a fascinating study on isolation. It's one study of many. I mean, I teach in the colleges social psychology, criminal psychology, so I could give you a lot of different experiments done on this. But University of Japan, they took a group of rodents, isolated a sample, I don't know, for about 15 days. And then after the isolation, they returned the rodents back to the community. And at the point of reentry, the isolated rodents attacked their community after 15 days of isolation. Why is that? Because during isolation, aggression levels go up, cortisol, adrenaline, and empathy, indicative by oxytocin, empathy goes down. We become more aggressive and we become less empathetic because of the social disconnect. So it's not good for man to be alone. We are social creatures. We don't do well when we're disconnected in any way, whether it's a loner in the corner or a loner in the crowd. Either way, that isolation paves the way. It's one of the ingredients that paves the way for violence, and it was certainly part of David's story.
fascinating. And here's what's interesting. And you brought up oxytocin and dopamine and some of the more positive bonding chemistry that we know about. And from my perspective, my first thought is, well, if he was a loner, which he was, and in your book you describe him as really loving the dark, a lover of the dark, and he also self-isolated. I mean, his dad tried on probably hundreds and hundreds of occasions to connect with his son, but he kept pushing his dad away. And it's interesting because it makes me wonder about, like, okay, what about family meal times? How
Mm.
how did this kid grow up eating? Right? Was it just Fruit Loops and the junk food of our day and of the 70s, right? That's when all those Captain Crunch and right, like just Pop Tarts and the junk food revolution was really in swing at that time, and it just makes me wonder, like, vitamin D, obviously that's the sunshine vitamin. Well, if he loved the dark, did he ever get vitamin D, right? And that's a key component to depression, and it directly activates oxytocin production.
You raise an excellent point,
So it
and
just makes
uh,
me wonder.
well, you don't have to wonder because you know what you're saying. There's actually data from my interviews that supports what you're saying. From the time David was a baby, he had two adopted parents, Nat and Pearl Berkowitz. Excellent adopted
Seem like
parents,
excellent parents.
very loving, very caring. But at 14 years old, his mother dies of cancer. Very traumatic event for him. She
Right,
dies of cancer. Dad, 1960s America, he's having to run a hardware store in the Bronx called Burke's Hardware. He was the manager of that store, the owner of that store. He's working these long shifts. David says to me, Mike, I'm 14. From 14 all the way to 20, or 18 when he left for the Army, I'm coming home. He says, I'm opening the cupboards. I'm eating Pop-Tarts. I'm making myself a burger. There's no real family time, not because my dad was a bad dad. He was trying to pay the bills. He's by
right,
himself now. And here I am really raising myself. And David had a problem with obesity. He was a heavy kid. In fact, that contributed a lot to some of the shaming that he
yeah,
experienced from his uncle, who body shamed him frequently. But that obesity didn't just happen. A lot of that
right,
was the result of David bonded with food. Food was obviously one of his attachments, a
right.
poor substitute for relationship, a poor substitute for true intimacy. And the kinds of food, I mean, David would be the first to tell you, he was definitely a junk food lover, definitely one that was eating way too many hamburgers. And that I'm sure that contributed to some poor brain chemistry.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was fascinating to me. Like, B complex vitamins is B complex vitamins leads to tryptophan being able to actually create oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, and L-theanine as an amino acid. Like, you have to have that to connect and to have empathy. I took some notes. GABA for calming, right? We have to have
Mhm.
all those things, but without vitamin B6, we don't we don't produce that.
Absolutely. And
So yeah,
you alluded to the fact that he was a creature of the dark. Uh, he would as a young kid, and he believes there was a demonic element to this. When I say demonic, that's not at the expense of all the psychological factors that I list in this book and that we're talking about
no, it
right
was
now.
in
There was
addition to.
it was in addition to and in tandem with an interplay
Yes.
between. I mean, I believe that there is a dark force, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I identify it as Satan. I don't know how the listener would identify it, but I believe that dark force is predatory. Like any predator would prey on vulnerability, prey on weakness. And some of those vulnerabilities is what we're discussing. If somebody is
Exactly.
not eating correctly, not taking care of the quote unquote temple of God, not in community, not in sunlight. I mean, God made man not to live in shanties with sheetrock and fluorescent lights, but he made
So
man to live
true.
in the garden. So when we're outside, we're going back to our natural habitat. And when we're inside, we're outside that habitat. So, we do better in our habitat. David Berkowitz was a creature of the dark, hiding in dark places all the time. His mother thought he was out playing with kids, playing stickball, and he's hiding in a closet for a couple of hours. So anything you
Under
could,
his bed. Like, that's just so, it's so
yeah,
scary.
a lot of shame. Because shame, as you know, shame is going to cause one to withdraw. The Bible says, if you're a Bible reader in Genesis, Adam and
Yep,
Eve, they were ashamed. They were naked and they're ashamed. And they did what? And they hid.
they
So
hid.
hiding is always subsequent to the sense of shame. And David had a lot of shame, and the shame definitely drove him to some dark places.
Agreed. I have a one burning question through the
Yeah.
whole book. Kept going back to, and this is a little bit of a right turn or a left turn, but we'll just move through this as it goes. But this is the one question I kept wanting to call you and ask you about. So through the book, you say, and he has said, that he felt like it was his fault that his birth mother died at birth. Like, his dad explained it, or his adoptive dad explained it as the doctor had to make a decision. But when David heard that, he said to himself, or maybe he said out loud, I wasn't clear, that he must have kicked his mom awfully hard to make her die on
Hmm.
the way out of you know of being born on that time. And I just wonder, like, did he ever talk about that to anyone when he was younger, or did anyone ever explain that it was not his fault?
No, back in the 1960s, the level of candor in conversations between parents and children was not
It's
very
true.
high. This is before Dr. Sparks. This is before our understanding of the
It's true.
child makeup. Of course, you had Jean Piaget, and he had done tremendous work in his theory of cognitive development, how children develop cognitively. And Piaget made the point, and it backs up David Berkowitz's perspective at that point at 5 years old. I mean, you might think
Right, he was 5.
ridiculous. How did he infer that? Well, at 5-year-olds are very egocentric in their thinking. Egocentric meaning a 5-year-old will believe that they are the cause of all things. It's a very natural thought process for a 5-year-old.
Yep.
The parents, his adopted parents, as lovely as they were, they didn't have the education we have now. Having that conversation, they probably didn't have the level of tact. They probably didn't have the level of explanations being in simple form. And then, of course, as we just said a minute ago, the candor of conversation that David could respond back with some of his confusion. There really wasn't
He
that
was too
level.
young.
Just internalized it. So, and it shows up in his dreams, which makes sense. I mean, Sigmund Freud taught us a lot about the dream world. He taught us that the dream world was a mental safety valve, that our deepest fears, taboo desires, all that surface while we're dreaming, because the prefrontal cortex is deactivated or really in inertia. So now all this imaginary stuff kind of comes to the surface, and David has these dreams that his biological father is out to kill him because of killing his wife. And he's haunted by these dreams. So he's believing early on at a young age that he is this evil child. And then he sees the movie Rosemary's Baby
Crazy.
in the late 60s, and Roman Polanski, if you remember the film,
Yep.
and he identifies deeply with this character in the movie Rosemary's Baby. I don't even think we ever see Rosemary's Baby, but it's alluded to, this offspring of Satan, and he identifies, this is me. And Proverbs says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so he becomes. Or as the philosopher Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. So he begins to sort of, brew internally this self-image that he is this evil, wicked kid. And boy, does that seed grow into an ugly harvest.
It sure does. I'm fascinated, and I tell my clients this all the time. Y'all, if you're not a client, now you're going to hear it. Like, our programming, mothers, fathers, teachers, preachers, or people that acted like that in our lives before the age of 18, we are pre-programmed. 95% of what we think happens before we're 18. And whether our value systems come into play here, things that that we have no way of putting into context, particularly before the age of 10 or 12, it's like we're thrown a bunch of facts at us, but we have no tree or organizational way to organize all those thoughts. And so, in order to make it make sense, we are egocentric. It is all about us. And so we take on things that aren't really true. I mean, I use a very trite example of you're a kid and your teacher tells you to draw a zebra and you draw it with spots and your teacher comes along and says, you don't draw zebras like that. And instead of going, oh, you're right, I was just having fun, like any adult would, the kid takes it like I'm a terrible artist. I should never draw again.
You take that a step further. David Berkowitz's teachers in the third grade, he's very hyperactive. You know, they don't know much then about ADHD or any of that. They see it as a moral defect. He's a bad kid because he can't sit still. And the teacher takes his desk and places his desk in the center of a classroom with about 40 kids. Actually, him and about 2 other students. And these 2 or 3 students, David being one, the teacher says the bad boys sit in this seat, and he's going to sit in the middle of a circle all day. He said, Mike, the level of shame, I didn't want to go to school. I remember telling my mom I was sick. She'd check my head. I'd take a rag and I'd rub my head so my head was hot, or I'd take the thermometer, put it up against the radiator. I was petrified of going to school because of this level of shame. So this shaming, there's a lot of studies done on the relationship between humiliation, shame, and violence. I believe that there is a strong connection between the two. I elaborate on some of those studies. The best illustration I can give, real colorful and simple, is if you take a beach ball and you push it, you submerge it into a pool. Look at the submersion as being insulted or degraded. You push the ball into the pool, and now you let it go. That thing is going to thrust up with force. And that's how shame produces an aggressive outburst. You go back to 1940, Germany, actually a little bit earlier in the 30s. We ask ourselves the question, how did these Germans become Nazis? How did they become cold-blooded killers? Prior to the war, World War II, they were a very humiliated and shamed nation because of their involvement in World War I. They had to make reparations to countries that they believed they were not victimizers of, but they were shamed. And Hitler comes to play, and he whips up that shame into rage. He knew how to manipulate that, call it a fuel, into aggression. And that's certainly David's story, is the shaming, its effects on self-image, not making excuses, by the way, just making explanations so that we can understand a little bit better as parents, as teachers, as caretakers on how to do this right.
Or better.
Better. Thank you. Yes.
At least better.
Yes, at least
I feel
better.
like, yeah, at least better, right? That's my take anyway, as a parent, right? Like, oh, I need to do this better and different. But I think that, to my audience, like, y'all can understand how isolation and shame and, maybe y'all do eat in secret and silence, and you do have things that we all have things that we do in secret. And I think it's interesting that you said that, I think it was 1 in 4 people or 1 in 5 people will actually keep a secret from their spouse for their whole life. Like, maintaining secrecy just deepens that shame. Brene Brown, she's the queen of vulnerability and taking all of these things and putting them out into the light, things that we have previously held as secret, in order to shine the light on them so that they don't control us.
And the shame not only fuels, the secrets not only fuel the shame, but it also
it's circular.
It's also creating a rift between us and people, a divide. I think it was the Swiss physician forget his name, but he said nothing separates us from people like our secrets. You know,
Right.
you're with someone, that secrecy, it's a big disconnect between you and the people you're with. So David had a lot of sidekicks, but he had more secrets than sidekicks. He had more secrets than friends. And those secrets, they put a wedge between him. He said to me often, he said, Mike, I felt like I was in my own little dark world. And boy, did that blossom into the 1970s when he's alone in an apartment in Yonkers, New York, and he's terrorizing the city. He's wanting to be noticed. He's writing letters to the media, leaving letters at the scenes of the crimes on top of the corpses, letters that he would sign, Monster. He would sign the Son of Sam. One of the names he signed was Chubby Behemoth. Chubby, interesting adjective he used, kind of gives some insight into his psyche, that he was calling himself while he was doing these crimes, Chubby, going right back to the shaming as a child. But there's this cry, and I believe it's apparent with a lot of your school shooters, a lot of your mass killers. If you studied their diaries, like Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, it's someone noticed me. Attention at any cost. Negative attention is better than no attention. I want someone to pay attention to me. And it's unfortunate that we're seeing such a rapid rate of these kinds of crimes. And I think it speaks to the sickness of our culture and some of the issues that you deal with in the show, Doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the quotes that I pulled out, and I'm not going to quote it perfectly, but like even in this era of helicopter parents, right? People like we're trying to keep our kids safe, and we're trying to like almost over parent, right? Like over protect makes it worse. So then it feels like, well, where's that? How do we make that connection better? How do we as parents, how can we do it different so that we don't have those results? If we're finding ourselves a little disconnected from one of our kids, how do we dive into that and try to create a better connection?
I'm a big proponent of empathy. Empathy requires lots of listening. I got to understand how you see it. In fact, there are three kinds of empathy. There's emotional empathy. I have to feel what you feel. And that's important because when I feel what you feel and I show you that I feel what you feel, maybe you're crying and I'm crying with you, or you're laughing and I'm laughing with you, and mirror neurons are activated in the brain and there's this emotional connection. Now you care what I know because you know that I care. So
Right.
emotional empathy paves the way. Then there's cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is not, I know I feel what you feel, but I can think what you could think. I can see how you see it. That's a lot of listening. It's a lot of asking questions versus giving lectures, and good questions that are going to probe. So there's that cognitive empathy. And then lastly is practical empathy. And that's the kind of empathy where you know what someone needs and the deed matches the need. So if someone needs space, you don't give them a hug. You don't want to give someone a hug that is demanding space. And if
Right.
somebody's needing a hug, the last thing you want to do is give them space. So, practical empathy is discerning the need, and the deed that you give is matching that need. The practical empathy is typically the outcome of the emotional and the cognitive empathy. Usually it kicks in pretty well when you've taken the time to feel what people feel and think what they think. Now, Nat was a great dad in the case of David Berkowitz, but he lacked a lot of that training. I mean, we're talking 1960s America. We can't even get it
Dad.
right now, and dad, and
Yeah.
alone
Yeah.
trying to do it. We can't even get it right in 2023 with all the information and all the resources. So, but I would say empathy bridges those gaps. I mean, if think about the Christian story, right? How does God reach man? Well, he puts himself in man's shoes. He demonstrates the ultimate act of empathy, and he bridges the gap between heaven and earth by stepping into our shoes, by actually
Come on.
living how we live, seeing how we see. And then Paul says in Philippians, let this mind that was also in Christ, let it also be in you, so that we should put ourselves in others' places, and we should think what they think and feel what they feel. And that's going to bridge that gap, that disconnect between us and the people we love.
Oh, I wish everybody could just hear the last 3 or 4 minutes of our conversation. Like, this world and this country at this time needs to understand the 3 different kinds of empathy. And if we
Hmm.
could just do that for a day,
Hmm.
one day, right, Doc? If everybody could just go, okay, I'm going to have my empathy day today, right?
Hmm.
And December 15th is going to be empathy day for our entire
Hmm.
country. And we're all going to stop and try to put ourselves in that person's shoe, in our boss's shoes, in our underling's shoes, in our kids' shoes, in our neighbors' shoes that we don't like, in our best friend's shoes who we already love. What kind of change would we have?
Well, I think you'd see a lot less violence because, especially the senseless violence that we see in America. Now, don't get me wrong, there's just as much violence in other cultures, but usually it's religious motivated. It's other, what we're seeing in America is like this no rhyme, no reason. Why did he walk into Walmart and shoot everybody up? It doesn't make sense.
Right.
That kind of violence, we'd see a lot less of that if there were these communal connections. It's very difficult for people to act out violently when they are loving their mother and father and they're in a intimate relationship with their kids and they care and they value those relationships. But when they're feeling like an outsider, even if they have these structural relationships in place, but there's not really a reciprocity, a quid pro quo, something give, something take, it becomes a lot easier to walk into a mall and to
Yeah.
unload a semi-automatic weapon. Usually the common denominator between all these shooters is that pariah, outsider mentality. Somebody noticed me. And I think the more we can bridge the gap through empathy, the less we're going to see some of these violent outbursts.
I think that's amazing. So I want to pull out maybe even another 50,000 feet because I love a big picture too.
Yeah.
So take this from where our country started. I know, just hang with me for a second, right? We are the independent, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, suck it up, keep moving forward, um, drive, workaholic. We don't really value, right? Our American mentality doesn't necessarily value rest,
Mm.
empathy, slowing down, stopping. Like, we are just drive faster, faster, more. Like, that's how do we, like, that's almost the basis for our entire country. So we have to unravel some of those pieces too. Don't you feel like that?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of changing the world is pretty
I know.
grandiose, but the I can't change the world, but I can change my world. And you
Right.
as a listener, you can't change the world. You'd be a fool to even spend too much time on that, but you can change your world. And there are probably people within your world that need a phone call today. They need someone to check on them, a visit, especially during the holiday season when the suicide rate is so high. Um,
Yes.
and the domestic violence rate and the mass shooting, all that stuff spikes during these holiday seasons. I mean, I can see why. You got people that are in front of a TV, seeing it on TV, the Hallmark channel, seeing families sitting together at the dinner
Oh,
table,
perfect.
going on social media, making the comparison between, their life and someone else's life. And look, social media is really a farce. They say a picture tells 1,000 words. I say a picture tells 1,000 lies. I mean, pictures,
That's beautiful.
you're seeing a picture of everybody smiling, right? You have no idea a second before they took the photo, they're screaming at each other, and now they're
Sure.
smiling for 1 second, and it creates this illusion. And now I'm constantly comparing my life to someone else's life, and the feeling of loneliness and isolation is only increasing. I think that it's incumbent upon us during this holiday season, pick up the phone, go visit someone. Don't just give them a digital emoji. Show up at their house with a big pie or something. Go old school on them. show up, actually go face to face, because the isolation is what's really fueling the mental health crisis in our country.
Agreed. And I think those of us who tend to be a little bit more introverted are the ones who really need to step up and move out. We're
Most
the ones, right? I am definitely, I'd be happy alone for days on end, and in silence, like I'm good. But that also creates some loneliness, right? And so to step out and be a little uncomfortable and go to your neighbor with maybe some cookies, gluten free, and say hey, or just a friendly card. You don't have to spend a ton of money. You can, create something easy, but or even just a hi and a hug, right? Just something simple.
Listen, David Berkowitz is probably more on the introverted side than the extroverted side, but
For sure.
fundamentally, I don't care how introverted you are listening to this podcast, you are a social creature.
Absolutely.
So
God created us for community.
you're so social that if you were on an island all alone, you would take a volleyball, paint a face on it, and call it Wilson.
Yes, we will.
Because we just
Absolutely.
need attachment. We need connection. In fact, if you're struggling with addiction, I would argue that you have a relationship with the bottle. You've got a relationship with the needle. It's more than just you're using it, you're bonding with it. I mean, you talk to addicts about their needle, their bottle, what it's like. And it's usually socially maladjusted people that are often gravitating, not all the time, but in many cases, gravitate towards addiction because the addiction is a substitute. It's a cheap, shallow, destructive substitute for true bonding, true intimacy. The beautiful thing is David Berkowitz today is a new creature.
That's where I was headed.
I would explain it partly by the fact that, yes, he had a conversion to Christ in 1988, but also, in addition to that, actually goes right alongside that. He is a man of community. He has 15 to 17 guys that he is mentoring. He bonds with those guys. He knows their names, their stories, their struggles. When he walks into the visiting room, I meet with him. They call him Pastor Dave. He blushes. He doesn't like the title, but they see him as a father figure. I mean, the community that this man has, I believe, explains a great deal of this transformed man. He found in prison, ironically, what he could not find in free society. And it's because of that community that he's a new creature.
And, of course, as much as I love my audience, I know that there are going to be some people out there, Doc, that say, oh, of course, it's the jailhouse conversion. And however, you made a really interesting point in your book about if it was just that, then there are times and places where his reaction to circumstances wouldn't be able to be overcome the way that he has overcome his anger, his outrage, his lashing out. He wouldn't be able to do that in every single situation that he now has control over, unless it was supernatural, unless it was Christ, unless it was a true conversion. We all are guilty of reacting versus responding, and you're saying that he has a a normal sense of response versus react.
Well, let me say this. In 1977, there's no doubt that he was a psychopath. Now, let's talk about what a psychopath is for a second. Okay. First of all, it's not a clinical term, it's a cultural term. In the DSM,
That's true.
In the DSM, the parallel would probably be antisocial personality disorder. And when we look at antisocial personality disorder, which is the highest prevalence in the criminal population, we're talking people that can't regulate impulses. They have either low or no empathy. They will not own their crimes. They're always passing the buck. Now, David, in 1977, he'd be the first to tell you, he lit up the psychopathy scoreboard. I mean, he was a bona fide psychopath. You don't do what he did and not be psychopathic. Now, when I meet with David for 34 sessions, people think that actions can tell you about someone's character. And I agree, actions is better than speech. That's for sure. But people can put on a good act. What's a better litmus test than actions is reactions. Because a reaction is an action in real time, under pressure, a person's caught off guard. The privilege that I had as a researcher of human behavior. So I'm going into this not just as a clergyman through rose-colored glasses, because I am a minister as well, but I'm going into this as a behavioral scientist. So is there a level of suspicion and cynicalness? Of course, skepticism goes with science. But I watch his reactions over 100 hours. In chapter 2, I described David Berkowitz angry. He had an incident with an inmate. Listen, we all get angry. It doesn't make him a psychopath to get angry. What makes him change is the fact that he had anger, but anger didn't have him. He was able to get angry.
So important.
He could navigate through that anger like a pro. It took him some time, but typically when people are upset and they're angry, they externalize. It's all about people, places, things, systems. It's all outside me. I watched David Berkowitz go down an introspective journey while he was angry, and we uncovered what was under the anger. That's not something a psychopath can do, regulate impulses the way he did. And I've had many other incidences with him where I've seen that kind of self-control, seen him exhibit empathy. Psychopaths don't exhibit empathy, not the levels he does. He responds to hundreds of letters a month from suicidal teenagers and ministers to them and shows great care to the people in prison. Am I arguing he should get out? Not arguing that at all. He doesn't even want to get out. He's going to be 71. But I am saying he's done the best he can over the last 35 years, and he has shown himself to be what I believe a case of transformation.
I think that that's remarkable. And, for me and my belief, and for many of my listeners, we read the miracles of Christ in the Gospels. We read all of those. We read the miracles of God in the Old Testament, from the, separating of the sea to the pillars to talking donkeys. But this is in real life, ladies and gentlemen who are listening. This is real life transformation. And this is what I like to bring into my practice, is this kind of transformation. Granted, I'm not usually working with psychopaths, but I am working with people who are addicted to their behaviors. And whether it's eating too many Oreos or too much food or drinking too much or whatever they're addicted to, their relationship trials or trauma, we all have our own set of addictions that can be just as damaging to our life. Maybe not just as damaging, but certainly damaging to our life at a different level. And so I want to bring this forward, that Christ can help everyone with those pieces. And I think it's interesting that you say that, and in your book, there's an interesting quote, that something about that anger, it's so hard for introspection for people who are angry. Introspection is very difficult because it's all out there. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, anger is to be explored. It's not to be ignored. When you get angry,
oh, that's beautiful. Okay, that's beautiful. Say it again.
Anger is to be explored, not to be ignored. So when you get angry, that's time to self-reflect. It's why God asked Cain the question, Cain, why are you angry? He's wanting Cain to look in, because if you don't look in, you're going to lash out. So the looking in, you're recognizing the enemy is not from without. You're recognizing the issue is inside. If I don't look in, I'm going to confuse the enemy as the guy in front of me, the boss, the fellow who cut me off in traffic. I've got to look inside. I'll use a funny illustration. If you're from the 70s, I know you don't watch horror movies, Doc, but if you watch that, it freaked me out as a kid. I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. When a Stranger Calls, and she's babysitting these kids, and she's getting these crank calls, and it's a lunatic, and she has the calls traced, and the police tell her at the end of the movie, the call is coming from inside the house. And you got to realize that the call, when you're angry, it's coming from inside the house. You think it's outside. You're
Oh, that was good.
confusing, Kane. Your problem is with Abel, but your problem is you, Kane. It's you against you. And when you're angry, if you don't take that road of introspection, self-reflect, you're probably going to lash out, and you're going to probably do something that's going to cost you a whole lot more than you want to pay.
That's okay. That was worth the price of admission, y'all. That was beautiful. That is so, I think that so many of us do have anger, and it does stem from the program that we've had, and just the cognitive dissonance that ultimately ends up happening is we all have masks. We all put these masks on that we wear every single day to make it look okay. That, like you said, like social media, or even just going to church, even, right? There's certain, like, you just want to make sure that everything looks right. And we put these masks on to hide our authentic self. And yet Jesus really wants us to be out there in our authenticity. And the way that he made us is so beautiful and so perfect. Psalm 139, right? Knit us together, and he oversaw all of it, and already knew what we were going to look like and who we were going to be, and our talents and our all of those pieces.
Mm,
Why are we so afraid to show that?
mm. It's a deep question. Yeah, I mean, showing who
Yeah,
we are,
it is.
that is such a powerful question. This, to be vulnerable, to put ourselves out there, the willingness to be known. I think all of that, my own theory is all of that was disrupted by the cataclysmic event in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And we've inherited the genetic predisposition from
God.
our predecessors, the pride that comes with the shame, all of that. It keeps us disconnected from each other and keeps us disconnected from God. And in that disconnect, some very evil and awful things can grow inside of us and around us.
Oh, there you go. That's it. We are genetically, in a way, pre-programmed to hide, right? That was exactly what we said at the beginning of your interview. Like, Adam and Eve, once they realized they had done something wrong, right? They tried to hide from God. They created the fig leaves, and God even asked, "Where are you?"
Yep.
But more out of like, right? He was kind of laughing, I would think. Like, I
Mm,
know exactly where you are. I can see everything you do. You cannot hide from me.
yes.
And
And
when we realize,
that's the silliness. They think they're hiding, but they're so, it's kind of like when my kids were little, we would play hide and seek. They'd hide, they'd do that.
you can't see me, you can't see me.
Exactly. I mean, that's the silliness, even in adult life, is we actually think that we're pulling it off, but we're not pulling it off. In fact, we're breaking the hearts of the people that care about us and that are wanting us to step forth and to open our mouths and to speak. And that's you. If you're hiding, if you're retreating, you're pulling away. There's more to risk in
Step
retreat.
in,
There is
lean
putting
in.
yourself out.
Yeah,
Yes.
lean in. I'm here. Dr. Caparrelli is here. Lean in. Reach out. We're here to help.
Absolutely.
And you have an interesting personal story that put you on a path of I have to assume that your path brought you to this, right?
Yeah.
Your
I was
own history with violence, your own
yes.
growing up. Y'all, he grew up in a mob family. Like, I think us really white people, us real white people that are out here, we kind of look at the mob as like sort of almost mythical, even though we knew that it happened. But we don't want to identify with it, but you grew up in it.
Yeah, I grew up in a town, Providence, Rhode Island, just a couple hours from New York City, about an hour from Boston, right in the middle of the two. That was just infested with that sort of thing. Providence, if you study its history, very mafia driven. And I grew up around that. My dad was not per se a member, but he was associated with certain people, and he had a friend growing up that was babysat me and was dismembered by the mob. And I remember the trauma of that at 6, 7 years old, hearing about Joey, being killed, and what that did with my psyche. And then my dad being in prison, visiting him. And then by the time I'm 17, I'm caught up in criminal activities, and I'm locked away in a juvenile jail. And while I was in juvenile jail, that's where my faith in God began. But I get out, my life turned around at 18 years old. And I went forth and became a pastor of a church, helping people with mental health backgrounds, with coming out of prison, kind of an inner city type church. And made that my mission. And that's really what put me on the path of meeting David Berkowitz. Of being a pastor for many years, I'd also pursued my PhD after the bachelor's and the master's in behavioral science. So wrote a book on mental health from a faith-based perspective called Dr. Jesus, mailed that to David Berkowitz. And then David reads the book, and within 2 weeks responds back, wants to meet. I visit him, and our relationship begins. So yeah, when I'm reaching out to David, for me, it was very familiar, because I had come out of a lot of darkness myself. And the guy that wrote the foreword, you want to talk mafia, they wrote the foreword of the book. Now we're talking high level mafia. He was an underboss, or a captain rather, in the Colombo crime family in New York City. Been a friend of mine for 20 years. His name is Michael Frances. He travels the world. He's got millions of subscribers on his YouTube channel, telling about his transformation from leaving the mob, living to tell the story, and now, on Fox News, traveling the world constantly, telling his story of transformation, and also in a lot of mafia documentaries. He's considered like a mob historian, but he writes the foreword of the book. And ironically, he was on the streets of New York as a mob guy the same time as the Son of Sam. So he kind of tells the parallels between the two of them, and how they both came to faith eventually. So we are all products of what God can do in a life, and redeeming the worst among us, David Berkowitz, Michael Frances, and myself.
Oh my gosh. I think that that's just like the cherry on the top of this interview. It's been so enlightening. And I think that, like I said, y'all, transformation, right? We talk about it from such a small health perspective. And we think, oh, well, maybe my transformation, I didn't come out of that. But your transformation, regardless of whether you're going to go into comparison mode, y'all, you will. Like, oh, well, I wasn't that bad. We all do that. But everything that we do, God sees it all as equal. I know that should be a podcast into itself. But like, whatever you're doing that's not healthy for you, whether it's going down the road of overeating or some other addiction, whatever that is, and we all have little addictions. I might be a little bit addicted to running. But we can all transform in different ways, and the power is amazing. And really, like, I'm in awe.
Well,
I'm
let
in
me
awe.
just encourage you. All the subjects that we discuss, you can go on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, and you could buy Monster Mirror today.
You have to get this, y'all. This is
Thank
so
you.
enlightening.
The book actually ranked on Amazon #1 new release in the true crime serial killer category. I'm kind of happy that it ranked #1 there, because there are a lot of people that need help in that category. So it's a
Absolutely.
light in the dark. It was #1 for 3 days in October, and the book has sold thousands since its release on October the 10th of this year. I strongly encourage you, read it, leave a review on Amazon. I'd so appreciate it. And let's keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. Y'all, I have dog-eared so many pages, highlighted and underlined so many things. This conversation barely touches the tip of the iceberg of what he goes into in this book and how this man has transformed. And I want to leave you all with to know that nearer to the end of the book, which you'll have to get to actually find this out, because I'm not going to give it away, there is a surprise that I was shocked that happened. And what David Berkowitz actually said near the end. So
Mhm.
I'm going to leave it as a little bit of a cliffhanger for you all, because you have to understand the power of the transformation that happened. And it was amazing. So I just want to say thank you, Doc, for joining me here today. It was an absolute pleasure. We've had such a great conversation, and it kind of went all over the place, which is exactly what I thought. And I'm of the belief that God is going to bring here and out of us exactly the message that he wanted. And whoever listens, you're exactly in the right place listening to this. So
You,
thank
Doc.
you, and thank you.
Merry
Thanks.
Christmas.